Okay, we are live. This could be a dicey one, everybody, but welcome to another episode of Gearbox 2.0. Hey, Bill. Hey, Travis. I did not go to Cinegear, Bill, and it is the first time in a long time. The main reason I didn't go to Cinegear is I have three children, but my oldest daughter graduated from high school and she had her commencement that weekend. So that's why I didn't go. But I am currently, because of that commencement and family and everything else, by the Oregon coast. It's a pretty janky setup here. I am actually, hey Harrison, so here's the deal. I have this new little travel head from Suray, which I really love. It's the VA5. It has a quick release, even though it's Arca Swiss, and I like it a lot. The only problem is, thank you, Bill, for the congrats. The plate that I took is somebody else's plate. Well, oh, I'm an idiot. There we go. And it has these two little pins here for a standard Arca Swiss, which are removable with a hex key, but they don't fit in here without taking those out. So I don't have the hex key. I don't have my red tool. I don't have my small rig tool. So I am literally, if I could show you this, on a log here with a package of wood for the fire pit, and then the camera is up there. And that's how I could get some height there. And hopefully you can hear me all right. I am outside. I'm undercover, so it shouldn't be too windy. It was raining a little bit, and that's what I got for you. So it's not going to be an hour-long episode, I can tell you that. And by the way, today's episode of Camera and Flask on this channel at 6 p.m. Eastern, that would be 11 p.m. British summertime, as I have now been yes, Bill, the small rig tool is worth it. It's cheap. And so is the red one. I have both of them. They're very similar, but I think it's good. Thanks, Casey, for the heads up on the audio. So basically 6 p.m. Eastern, Caleb and I, because Ben is off on a 5-day motorcycling trip with some friends, we'll be talking about WWDC and the cheese grater. We'll be talking about some of the announcements that came out of Cinegear and just kind of giving you our general thoughts about some of that stuff and where we see things heading, general production questions and all of that kind of stuff. I don't really have a big topic for you today for Gearbox, but what I do want to do is, of course, answer any questions that anybody has that are general business questions or production-related questions having to do with video production and filmmaking. I don't generally concentrate on narrative, so we're not talking about big budget or even small budget feature lengths, but I've done a lot of different types of work, so I'm happy to answer those questions. So I'll keep an eye on the chat here. I'll talk to you about some things. I think I'm just going to start off by talking a little bit about traveling. And I travel primarily for business, though there are times where I'm on the road and I'm traveling with family and still have to do business. That's what this is. It's tricky. It requires some rethinking in terms of how you do things. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with what time zone you wind up in. Because if you have client communication and you still have to manage jobs, anybody that's working with you on those jobs, primarily post-production if you're away, has to sort of be on the same page with you in terms of when you're communicating, when you're getting deliverables to your clients and stuff like that. I'll answer. I don't know the answer to that, Casey. Casey's asking, do you know if the ATOMOS Ninja 5 does proxy files? I can't find anything on that. I don't believe it does. I don't think that you would probably just have to rely upon your camera system, depending on what that camera is, for those proxies. It would be really, really cool if you could do like a ProRes 4x4, and then you could also have a really low data rate version. But with you know, with new RAW formats coming out like ProRes RAW, those data rates are still pretty small to begin with. I think if you pick, I guess you're trying to do dual recording, right? You're trying to do a higher quality recording and a lower quality proxy on that same device. And to my knowledge, that is not the way any of the ATOMOS devices work. You'd generally have to have a dual drive system. So either a single drive that's been split and it allows you to do something like that, or 2 drive slots, which to my knowledge, no ATOMOS device has ever had. So, so when you're traveling with your family, yes, it's planning in terms of the other people who are involved in the things that you're delivering, but it's also managing your time so that you can actually have time with your family. And it's a very hard thing to do. Casey, tell me what camera you're using in terms of your proxy workflow that you're looking at. So for me, it's getting up early. And what I like to do is I used to be, when I was younger, you know, the night owl, and I would pull all-nighters and stuff like that. That doesn't do well for you being out with your family during the day. I do find that if I just wake up incredibly early, I can get 2 or 3 really good hours in. Everybody sleeps in anyway, and it seems to work out. We have these things now, which are fantastic and also horrible at the same time, mainly because they're always there, and texting has made it even worse. There's an immediacy to that. So the other tip is, if you, pardon me, if you really want to have family time, then you need to let your clients know that you're going on vacation. Actually let them know. And that's hard to do if you're self-employed. But there's also an understanding there. If you're always available for your clients, then, you know, you let them know you're going on vacation. They should be understanding. And that's, of course, going to have to do with your deliverables and making sure you plan that out and let people know and all of that stuff. And that's just communication. The other little tip, which is not related to travel, but is just something you might want to think about when it comes to doing business, is whatever you set as the precedent with a client at the beginning of your relationship with them is going to be what their expectation will be for the entirety of your relationship with them. And what I mean by that has to do with scheduling. If you keep your communication to that client between, let's say, waiting for it, the hours of 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. in your time zone, and you don't answer communications from that client outside of those times, then generally they'll start to understand that that's their time for communication with you. If you answer emails at 1 o'clock in the morning and on weekends and things like that, that will be the expectation of that client. They will think, and they will be right to think, that they can get a hold of you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that's just another little tip. I apologize. It's not a super busy road. It's the 101 in Oregon, but there's going to be more traffic here than I would like. So Casey's still waiting to find out what camera system you are shooting with, because that may be a little bit of insight into what you might be able to do in terms of a workflow. Sony a7 III, I can record to both, but trying to have one workflow. So look, the A7 III files are small to begin with. Even in UHD, they are 100 megabits per second. They're not hard for an NLE to deal with. It just depends what you're trying to give your client in terms of a proxy file. I would just say, honestly, that you'd probably just want to keep it into that workflow, unless, of course, what you're trying to do is get and eke out a little bit more quality out of the HDMI out to that ATOMOS. You could consider the internal files as proxies. I understand that you're trying to, you know, make the workflow a little easier. Some camera systems will allow you that workflow automatically. A good example of that is the C300 Mark II. It has an SD card slot. It will do an HD, essentially proxy, 35 megabits per second, 8-bit 420. And then, of course, what you're recording to the CFast cards or externally through the monitor or the recording terminals is much, much higher quality. Hey, D-Tech Logic, nice to have you on the live stream. Questions from Andres. Question, Jem, what file or project transfer tool do you use or recommend? So we're using Frame.io primarily. So when we're on set, it's either Hedge or ShotPut Pro for checksum verification and offloading to multiple drives. And then when it comes to the post workflow, we're actually using Frame.io now as our file transfer. It's incredibly efficient, and it not only is the place where clients are going to actually view and annotate and give us feedback on the files that we're working on, but it's also how they are downloading files. So that's my answer. I mean, you know, there's still various drop boxes and WeTransfers going on here and there. For me personally, we're pretty much exclusively settled on Frame.io as our system. Of course, that does require a subscription, so you have to be aware of that when you are using that service. But if it's something that you can use for many clients, then the cost of Frame.io is very, very reasonable. And the feature sets just keep getting better. And I've said it before, it has completely changed the way I do post-production in my company, not only with clients externally, with consolidated feedback from everybody on the client side, and then changes only starting after that in most situations, but also for internal. So what we'll do is we'll set up Frame.io where we have an internal project, and that internal project essentially has all of our internal reviews for me as a post supervisor, and then the files then get, once they're approved by me, they go into a client folder for essentially rough cuts, which are pretty fine cuts at that point. We do deliver final project files to Frame.io, but only to a certain point. And then what we'll do is we'll FTP them. Generally, what we'll do is we'll actually dump the final masters onto a hard drive and then just have that shipped down, you know, USB-C drive or whatever, and make sure that the cable's in there for type A. And then they can transfer stuff over and then get it back, especially if they need it in a higher quality format. But if you're just delivering in ProRes up to HQ, then you could use Frame.io. That, of course, is going to be limited by how much storage you have with the plan that you are using. Bill asked, Jem, could you make a Gearbox episode applying for in-house or other jobs? Things like making a CV, creating a real portfolio, and content of the interviews. Bill, that's a great question. I don't think that I'm the right person to do that because I've been self-employed for 23 years and I wouldn't know the first thing about how to do that the right way. I don't have a CV or a resume. I don't have any tips for applying for in-house except for just be conversational and make sure that, you know, make sure that they understand what your skill sets are without overselling yourself. I'd rather undersell over deliver and be realistic about where my strengths are than to say I can do everything. Because also just a little tip here, because I teach a lot of people who work in-house, one of the hardest things that you're going to have to deal with when you go in-house is, unless there's a big team there, which generally there isn't, the expectation is that you are going to have to do everything. And you have to be careful about when you go in there in terms of what their expectation is of what they should be getting out of you. Again, do you want to be on call 24/7, or do you want to take this job so that you can have more time for your family, for your friends, for your side projects, and whatever else you're going to do? It doesn't mean you should be taking the job just to do those things. Hopefully it's a job that you're going to like. But I would say that, you know, you really have to look at, if you're applying for an in-house job, how much you know, editing is the killer. Because if you're going in for production, that can generally happen within those hours of production for a company. But as soon as post-production enters into the equation, as soon as you put yourself onto that part of it, those conversations have to happen very early on in terms of when that editing occurs. Now, it's one thing that, you know, 3 times a year, there's big events that you're going to have to burn, you know, the midnight oil and make sure that you're getting something out the door when it needs to get out the door. But it's another to have the expectation that every weekend that you're on call to make sure that an edit gets in. you might as well be self-employed then. Trust me. I know. It's coming. One of the other things that I would just say when you're traveling for business, and this is a mistake that I made very early on, is depending on where you live, find an airline and find a hotel group that you can latch onto. I've found that this has made a huge difference in terms of not only comfort of travel, but just getting all of those points. I'm in the Marriott group for the stays that I'm in, and sometimes those can be significant because I might have a crew of 2 or 3 people traveling and we have 2 or 3 hotel rooms. Those points can be the difference between me going on a vacation with my family once a year and spending thousands of dollars on accommodations, or nothing because I have loyalty to a particular hotel brand. So it doesn't matter so much, Jem. You have experience in the field, so anything you can help, please think about it. Yeah, I will, Bill. I mean, a lot of it really has to do with making sure that you're setting yourself up for, or the client up for the correct expectation, because I think that the big mistake that we all have when we're looking at a new project or something new is that we really are eager, and that eagerness can really come back to bite you. It doesn't mean that you don't want to deliver great products. It does mean that you just have to be a little bit careful in terms of what you're telling the client in terms of an expectation of your deliverables. As new in the field, but been doing video shooting for a while, what is the best way to start the new phase of video shooting with potential client or getting our foot in the door? Well, I think the best piece of advice I can give people is think about the type of work that you want to do. One of the biggest challenges that we have in this industry is it's so diverse in terms of the types of projects that you can do and the types of clients that you can have, that it can help tremendously to identify areas or an area that you'd like to do work in. I've spoken about this before. I listened to the Wandering DP podcast, and you listen to various directors and directors of photography and other people who are in production talk about, you know, how they got to the point that they are right now. And a lot of them, a common thread is they identified the type of work that they wanted to do, and then they started to do projects with other people that they work with. Some of it spec work, but not spec work for an agency that's saying do work for free, but to build up a reel of the type of work that you would like to be getting. And of course, it is trying to get into or onto sets or on location where that type of work is being done, maybe in a lesser role. So it really, you know, sup, David, has to do with the type of work that you're trying to do. But I would say very much so. Obviously, the exposure is going up in the background and everything. It would have a lot to do with what type of work you want to do. For me, I enjoy education. I enjoy production. And one of my areas of expertise is creating educational content around equipment related to this industry. So I like creating that content. I like the challenge, and I'm constantly unhappy with what that is overall in terms of, well, I'm not unhappy. I'm just never completely satisfied, and I'm always trying to improve upon what it is that I'm doing. And I try to do that both with the videos I'm creating and then also with the live or workshop-based education. So there's always adjustments. You know, you can get into these ruts where you, seagulls, you start to do the same thing for long periods of time. And when you do those things for long periods of time, they become comfortable to you. Comfortable is not a good place to be in our industry. You should always be trying to identify and find places where you can push yourself. And uncomfortable might be changing your style of lighting, changing the way your composition is. And this is sort of a journey that almost all of us go through continuously. in the fact that we're trying to find our voice in the way that we like to see things. But we also, if we're DPs, have to realize the way somebody else wants to see those things. And hopefully in the longer term, you're either a chameleon and you enjoy that and you can serve up what somebody wants to see creatively, or even for yourself as a DP or a director DP, that you're creating the things that are inside of your head. So, you know, I do a lot of handheld, a lot of stuff on sticks, but I don't generally shoot as much with shoulder rigs. I do, but I don't do it a lot. And I really like that look and I like that style of shooting. And so I'm starting to do more of that. And I'm sure that that will affect my composition for certain things. It will affect the focal lengths that I'm using on my camera in terms of being more intimate. So maybe I'll go with a wider focal length so I can get in tighter to, you know, somebody and feel more present to where they are. And of course, focal length on your lenses has a lot to do with the way that we see the shape of people's faces, and of course, depth of field and a lot of other things. So depending on how you want to feel in a space, if you were in a crowd and you wanted to shoot somebody, you would probably generally do that on a wider focal length, unless you wanted to feel voyeuristic, where you would back up and you'd be on a longer focal length and essentially picking them out of the crowd, but everything else just sort of disappears. But if you want to feel like you're inside of that crowd, then you're going to get into that crowd and you're going to be on a wider lens. You're not going to have a depth of field that's as shallow, but that also means that you're going to feel like you are inside of that space, whatever that space is. What other questions do we have? I think I'm going to go for about a half an hour, because that whole thing about family and then making sure that I am wrapped up for this one. Just as a note, today at 6 p.m. Eastern, we have Cameron Flask. I mentioned earlier at the top of the show that Ben is off on a road trip with some friends for the next 5 days. So it'll be Caleb and I, and we will be talking about WWDC, the cheese grater, some other things, maybe a little bit about the iPad Pro and apps and things like that. And we'll also be talking about Cine Gear and some of those announcements. Lighting can get expensive, but as a beginner, what set of lights or a kit that you would rank that's affordable? Well, that's kind of like a, that's a big question. I'm a big believer in having different fixtures for creating different types of light. But if you have only one choice, you want to choose a harder light source, which you can then soften. I'm also a big believer that nowadays, if you can go into a bicolor unit that can get you from about 3 or 3200 Kelvin to about 56 to 6000 Kelvin, that you give yourself a lot more options in terms of different shooting environments and things like that. It can be very advantageous to have a high output, softer light source, but I would prefer to have something that was a little harder that I could then soften up with a softbox or a rag, you know, a piece of diffusion and things like that. So while they're not necessarily the lights that I would use day in and day out, the Astra 6X lights happen to have lenses that are 45 degrees. So they're not super wide, they're not super tight. They tend to be great for bouncing off of things, and they're also quite good for pushing through things to diffuse. The timpani light from Luxli is a very affordable 1x1, and that's a full RGB AW, amber white, and is a really interesting light to have. Also good, not as good for bouncing because of the lenses on it, but decent, but good for pushing through things, and you can, of course, diffuse that quite easily. And then littler lights, and of course, if you're traveling, things like the flex lights are amazing because they pack flat and they still give you that same kind of output that you're getting out of an Astra or a timpani, but you have a much more compact kit and also mounting options that you don't get with those lights, where you can just slap them on walls or ceilings or anywhere else around columns with gaffer's tape and stuff. So they're pretty awesome. And then you've got to have some harder lights. You've got to have some lights that are, you know, like little FIILEX lights or things like that, which will let you do specials where you put a little bit of light on an object and things. So I think you round it out. It's getting pretty good right now. We've got a lot of lights that give you a lot of output. Watched Brooklyn Phono some time ago. Always wondered how you find the interviewees if you don't know anyone in the field that is being researched. Are you saying how do you find it? Well, we boy, I don't know how Matt Porwall and I found Brooklyn Phono. We had some sort of contact through somebody, and we went and both scouted individually that location, and we just were absolutely fascinated by the husband and wife team that were the owners of that business. And we knew that for the project that we were doing, that we could get a nice documentary short. But we spent a lot of time being out there to make sure that they were right, and also gaining their trust to be in their space and to document their process, and also to find out more about who they are as people. When we're doing a project like Brooklyn Phono, no, Canon is not. Generally, I pitch to Canon, and I think that there may be some, not misconception, but when I do a project for Canon, it's kind of strange. Matt Porwall's was a little different because he was the one on camera, so I was producing and directing. But when I've done a lot of the educational videos for them, I'm also producing and directing. I'm just talent as well. So I plan the shoot, the location, I create the outline. We, of course, talk out what the concepts are, but I'm generally pitching to them what I think would be a good idea to create an educational series around that. Now, there are exceptions to that. The C200 one was a good one to talk about. Originally, we were going to shoot that here in Oregon, and then Canon really wanted to highlight and show their new Burbank facility. So the original proposal, which had us doing production here, basically got revised and updated to doing the production in LA, which is where we shot the whole C200 series. How bright should you go with your basic light kit, meaning max power output? Travis is asking. Well, that's a good question. I mean, you have to think that if you're based in the US, as a baseline, you're thinking about, 10 amps as your baseline for what you can plug into. And so that really means that if you do the math, that you don't want to plug in more than 1,000 watts into there. That's kind of your safety. So if you know that you have more than one basically breaker, you have more than one option in terms of where you can plug into, then you can just multiply. But use that 10 amp as your baseline. So, okay, 1,000 watts. Now, the beautiful thing is that you could plug in 3 Aputure 300Ds and still have 100 watts left, which would be an LED, almost 2 LED 1x1s at around 55 watts. So yeah, I think there's a lot of options there in terms of what you can do in terms of your max power output. But you can get a sky panel, you can get an Area 48. The things that we can do in terms of plugging into an outlet. Yeah, I mean, you can go a Joker 800, which has about 2.5 times the output of its power draw, an HMI, but you're going to want to dedicate that to a single circuit in terms of using it with maybe 1 or 2 LEDs on there just for, for giggles. Not for giggles, but for lighting. Any other questions that we have for this week? I'm going to wrap up. This is getting ridiculous back here in the background. And what will happen is if I start to stop down, then of course my exposure is going to go down. The background will go down. It's not going to balance very well. It's going to be ugly. Another great future episode for Gearbox would be the steps for creating a documentary, a docu-style ad. Yes, Bill, incredibly time-consuming, not something I don't want to do. Subscribe. I'm sure you guys are, but if you get people to subscribe, the more people I have on this channel, the more time I can dedicate to creating free educational content for you. And that's the truth of it, because the more eyeballs you have, the more attention you get from manufacturers and people in the industry, and the better chance I have of being able to take this channel to the next level. And trust me, there is a next level. I have a big space that I would like to build out to create ongoing educational content. But tell your friends, get more people to come over here and subscribe. I'm not a great salesman when it comes to that kind of stuff, and I forget to put affiliate links on things, and I'm pretty horrible at it, actually. But I do enjoy creating this content, and my real goal is just to create content so that you can learn how to do things in a better way, so that you can up your production value and feel more confident in the things that you're doing. So about half an hour in, again, I recommend that you come back at 6 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to drive back to the the barn in a little while. And when I get back there, I'll set up for Cameron Flask, and we're going to be talking about WWDC. We're going to be talking about Cine Gear. It's going to be myself. It's going to be Caleb Pike, and we will toast to Ben on his motorcycle trip. And thank you very much, everybody, for watching and for coming by. We'll see if next week is going to be David, you can hit the sauce now. I won't judge you, but I don't know what shape you'll be in. But I'll see you guys next time on